So recall that the domain is the set of all values a function will accept as inputs, in other words, your x's, and your range is the set of all values that a function will return as outputs, or your y's. It is true that a value is in the domain of a function only if there is a point on the graph at that x value, and the same is true that a value is in the range if there is a point on the graph at that y value. So we're going to be utilizing this knowledge to actually find our domain and range of graphs. So thankfully these are much easier than they often seem. So it's important to note that all linear functions, every single line, that just means line, that's not horizontal or vertical, which means it's diagonal, have a domain of all real numbers and a range of all real numbers. What that means is that this graph goes on forever and ever and ever. It never stops. So if you see a line, this is true for all diagonal lines. Their domain is all real numbers, and their range is also all real numbers, because these graphs never stop. So all lines have this domain and range, all real numbers for both. Every single line, no matter what. That means 4 is in the range, because if I go over to the number 4, if I go up to the number 4, there's a point. That means that the number 7 is in the domain, because even though I can't see it, if I were to go all the way over to the number 7, which is here, and I were to go up, eventually I would run into the graph. This means that the number -2 is in the domain, because if I go over to -2 and I go up, I find a point. This means that 5 is in the range, because if I go to 5 and I go over, I find a point. Every single number will be on that graph, because there's always a point there. Now, quadratics, parabolas, they're a different story. So, the domain is always all real numbers, because parabolas, which are U-shaped graphs, never stop getting bigger to the left and the right. They're always moving left and right. So every x value will work. Every x value is a possible input. But our range is different. So domain is always all real numbers. The domain is always all real numbers. Our range is going to be a different story. Our range is determined by either the highest point that's if the parabola looks like this, or the lowest point. And that's if it looks like this. So if our graph looks like this one right here, then the range, will be y's that are greater than or equal to this number, whatever that number is, which in this case is 0. So our range for this parabola is y's that are greater than or equal to 0. If you look at the next graph, it's a very similar graph. So because it's a parabola, the domain is all real numbers. That is always true. Remember, our range is going to be determined by the highest or lowest point. So if it opens up, which it does, then the y's are greater than or equal to whatever this number is right here. Be very careful when you're counting. Notice that this is 10 right here, which means that every single one of these lines actually represents 2. So this value here is, sorry, let's try to draw that arrow again. This value here is 6. So the range is y is greater than or equal to 6. So I want you to draw this table. So we're going to draw 3 things. We're going to draw our graph. We're going to write our domain. We're going to write our range. All right, if our graph is a line, the domain is all real numbers. And our range is also all real numbers. Okay. If we have a parabola that opens up, our domain is all real numbers. Our range is going to be y's that are greater than or equal to. I'm going to go back over here and I'm going to call this point x, y, because that's what it is. It's some x value and some y value. Whatever this y value is here is what will go here. If I have a parabola that opens down, that's our third possibility. The domain is again all real numbers. Our range in this case is going to be y's that are less than or equal to. Again, I'm going to call this point xy. Whatever this y value is here will go right there. So this is a parabola. Its domain will be all real numbers. It opens up, so it's going to be y's greater than or equal to. We're going to look at this value. What's the y value there? Well, if I move to the left, this would intersect the y-axis at 0, so it's going to be y's that are greater than or equal to 0, because this value, this ordered pair would be the ordered pair 3, 0. And that's what's going to go here. All right, we're actually not going to do the rest of these because you have no use for them on your quiz. So moving on to the checkup, questions 1 through 10, you're supposed to determine the domain and the range of each function. Well, we've talked about how to do that from a graph. Now I've got to figure out how to do that from a table as well, or from a mapping. It's actually really easy. Our domain is our x's. They're the ones on the left. Our ranges are y's. They're the ones on the right. If something is in our domain, that means there's an arrow coming from it. So 1, 2, 3, and 5 are all in the domain. If something is in the range, that means there's an arrow going to it. So 8 would be in the range. 12 would be in the range, and 22 would be in the range. 15 would not be in the range because there's nothing mapping to it. Number 3, it asks us for the domain and the range. Well, this is a line, so this means that all real numbers are in the domain. So all real numbers are in the domain. And the same thing is true of our range because that is true for every single line. Number 5, we're not going to do that because you will not have one that complicated on your quiz. So we're going to move on to I'm going to do number 6 with you instead. So it's a parabola that tells us our domain is all real numbers. So the question is, what's our range? Well, this parabola opens down. So going back to that chart I gave you, that means it's going to be y's that are less than or equal to whatever the y value is here. Well, the y value it tells you is 7, so that's going to be your range. Number 7, it's a parabola, so the domain is all real numbers. Your range, well, this parabola opens up, so it's going to be y's that are greater than or equal to whatever this y value is here, which is 8. And lastly, number 9, it's a line, so the domain would be all real numbers, and the range would also be all real numbers.